This lecture is going to look at one of the founding principles in a little bit further detail, and that is federalism. Federalism is a topic that I think kids often, they see in action every day, but they don't necessarily understand how that works in terms of the actual governing of our country. Federalism, very simply, is the division of power between the state government and the federal government. So there are certain powers that the federal government has that the state government does not, or the state governments do not, and vice versa. There are certain powers that the state governments have that the federal government doesn't. And then there are also things where they kind of work together to try and accomplish a task or divide that power out to best benefit the citizens of our country. The issue of federalism could easily be seen through the COVID-19 response, both at the federal and state level. And we'll kind of talk about that a little bit more when we have our discussion on federalism in a couple of days. I think it'll be a little more clear as to what we're talking about with how federalism plays into our system of government. But just very basically, to understand that the federal system or federalism is the division of power between state government and the federal government. What they have to see in that definition is division of power between these two levels. What is essentially created then is a system where the U.S. government is broken into different levels of government. So even something as small as Boone County Board of Education, we are governed by that. There are 13,000 school districts across the country. Those are 13,000 separate governments, and they hone in on a very specific piece of policy, but ultimately kind of work with all these other different groups to administer education policy. So at the federal level, you have certain things that can be done. You have the U.S. Department of Education. They can have national initiatives, but then you also have the states that are responsible for making those individual determinations. So an example that you guys would probably be familiar with is a lot of the standards changes that you have maybe seen, and a focus on maybe standards-based grading that's coming in a little bit. But a lot of that comes from the initiatives of the state government. And then the local governments can determine how they're going to administer that. So Boone County Schools has said we're going to administer the understanding of the new standards through a system of standards-based grading. So a lot of that stuff, the national, the state, the local governments are all working together and all to administer that policy, but they all have different things. The national government is not telling us as a school district to implement standards-based grading. The state government isn't necessarily telling us to implement standards-based gradings, but the state government is giving us direction in terms of the standards, and the U.S. government is giving the states direction in terms of where they should go. So federalism is just a division of power between these different groups in order to govern a certain territory. And the framers wanted this for a couple of reasons. First, they wanted a strong national government to maintain order. As we saw in a previous lecture, the Articles of Confederation ultimately failed because the national government did not have the ability to override the decision of the states. When the states had too much power, we were too loose of a connection and were unable to really operate as a unified country. So federalism gives us the ability to have a strong national government. It's very hard in an area like the United States, where you're essentially looking at 4,000 miles separating east to west, or I guess, I don't know, not very good at estimating distance, but a very, very broad distance in terms of going to Alaska, Hawaii. So it's very hard for a federal government to come in and just tell Hawaii, this is how you have to do things, to tell California, this is what's going to happen. So the large geographical size lends itself to the states governing their own territories in a way with the assistance of the federal government. Ultimately, as you're going to see, and I'll discuss on the next slide a little bit more, the state governments can also practice certain policies for our national government. And if certain things are working within a state, that can be brought to the national level. But also it's a breeding ground or a training ground for politicians. And a lot of our politicians have gotten their work started at the state level. You think of even presidents, someone like George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, they start out as governors and ultimately work their way into the national level. So it kind of serves as a training ground for both policy and politicians in order to help facilitate some of those decisions that our government makes. I bolded a couple of the key advantages and disadvantages, and I'll talk about those. You don't necessarily have to know all of them, but the bold ones I would definitely write down and understand, because I think it's important that you see there are positives and negatives to the federal system. First and foremost, local governments can handle local problems. There are certain things that our area deals with that maybe other areas in the state don't deal with. You look at, you go to the eastern portion of Kentucky, and you're dealing with a different level of poverty because you're talking about Appalachia, you're talking about underdevelopment, you're talking about coal mining. That's going to be a lot different than, say, in northern Kentucky, where you're very developed, a lot of infrastructure, a higher population. So there's different problems that each area within a state have to deal with. So the local government is best able to handle the decisions and the problems that that area is going through. So there is an advantage in the fact that it is our own policy. Thinking about the COVID-19 response, as of the recording of this lecture, we are planning on going back to school on a hybrid schedule, A day, B day. There are people that are going to be virtual, and we're trying to navigate that because, according to the citizens of Boone County, that is essentially what they wanted. If you go one county over, Kenton County is dealing with, as of now, a synchronous model where, whether you are in person or not, you are to log into the computer and you're going to be lecturing, or the teacher is going to be lecturing for the normal time of first period, second period, third period. And then you would have to go on to, after first period, you'd have to log off of your online lecture and then move on to a second lecture with a different teacher, and kind of like transition classes that way. That's different than what we wanted. So you're talking about two different policies, and the local governments are dealing with that in a little bit more effective way based on their local constituency or local citizens. There are more access points for political participation. It is much easier for you to get involved in state and local elections than possibly it is to get involved in the federal election. However, there's more access for you to vote. There's more access for your voice to be heard. It is much easier to protest in Frankfort than it is to protest in Washington, D.C. You are also more likely to be heard in Frankfort than you are going to be heard in Washington, D.C. So it just increases the ability of the citizens to participate in the system and to participate in government. And last but certainly not least, an advantage is, in whether it's right or wrong, it can foster experimentation and innovation within a given state. A lot of times what can happen is states will practice a certain policy. And a good example would be when George W. Bush was in Texas as the governor. He implemented a policy that worked for the state of Texas. It was an education policy that relied heavily on testing to hold teachers accountable, and really kind of focused heavily on student performance. And when he became president prior to 9/11, he signed into law No Child Left Behind. And what that did was kind of transformed education to a reliance on standardized testing and focusing on holding teachers accountable and students accountable through performance. He wouldn't have done that had that not worked in Texas. Unfortunately, what we have found out is that didn't necessarily work at the national level. So we kind of got rid of it and transformed it into, I guess, race to the top now is what we're essentially doing. I don't know if the Trump administration has done much in terms of developing that education policy, but beyond what Obama did. But it allows a state to practice something. It allows the state to put it into practice, and then if it works, we are able to adopt that at the national level. So that's another advantage is it's not something that the federal government's just pushing out to everybody without seeing some sort of success already. Some disadvantages, it's difficult to achieve unity. And we have, especially with COVID-19, a lot of division in terms of how this has been handled, and thinking about it, like certain states are being, I guess, shunned or blocked from going into other areas. Like I know in New York, if you go to Florida, you have to quarantine for 14 days. So that, that can lead to some tension between the states. You have a situation where an education program might be better in one state than another, or it might be worse in one state than another. You have different rules for voting within the federal system or within the state system. In Kentucky, you might have to have an ID to vote, but in Ohio, you might not. So it's very hard to develop that national unified policy in a system of federalism, because the states do have so much freedom when it comes to their own governing. State governments may resist national policies. So and I think you're seeing that right now. A good example would be Donald Trump's executive order on immigration and limiting immigrants coming from a certain country or whatever. States can say, we're not going to do that. You have cities that are saying we're going to be sanctuary cities. Essentially what those cities are doing is they are going against federal law. The federal law states that, if you're an illegal immigrant, we've got to take you through this process of the judicial system and do what we have to do. Those states are essentially saying, or those cities are essentially saying, we're not going to do that policy. So they're resisting that national policy. On the flip side, you kind of see that with a lot of your conservative sheriffs and stuff. Even though that's local, they are resisting national policies by coming out and saying, we're not going to enforce these mask mandates. Now, that's a different conversation for a different day, because it's not in the jurisdiction of the police officers. But there is that ability, because those local governments do have some freedom. And then ultimately, law enforcement and justice are uneven, because a crime in one state, even something as simple as speeding, it's unevenly distributed in terms of the punishment. If you speed in Kentucky, you're going to get a fine, and you're going to pay that fine to the county. However, if you speed in Georgia, you are actually going to pay a double fine, because you have to pay a fine to the county and to the state. So I had a friend of mine who got a speeding ticket. It was not me, so don't be reporting me to any police officers that you know. But he got a speeding ticket, and his speeding ticket was something like $700, because he had to pay in Georgia to the county and to the state. But that is not the same as speeding in Kentucky. So you're talking about essentially the same road, because it was I-75, but two different enforcements of that law. And that's one of the other problems with the federal system. What you have are two types of powers going to the federal government. First are enumerated powers, and this is a vocab term that I want you to know, because we will talk about enumerated powers for each of the branches of government as well. But enumerated powers just simply means that it is specifically stated in the Constitution. So the federal government has the ability to tax. The federal government has the ability to coin money. The federal government has the ability to make laws. Those are all enumerated because those are specifically granted in the Constitution. The other types of powers that the federal government has are implied powers. And in a previous lecture, we talked about the necessary and proper clause, and how that said that the federal government is able to do things that are necessary and proper for conducting the powers that are listed below. The example that I gave is the creation of the Federal Reserve. It does not say that they have the right to create a Federal Reserve, but it is implied through the necessary and proper clause. So there are certain powers that are implied by the language of the Constitution that can give the federal government powers as well. So do know the difference between enumerated and implied powers. The state government gets all of their power from the 10th Amendment, and we talked about that in the previous lecture as well. All powers not delegated to the national government belong to the states. So this is often seen as reserved powers. So who is responsible for regulating commerce within the state of Kentucky? Kentucky is. Who is responsible for policing the state of Kentucky? Kentucky is. Who is responsible for the education system in Kentucky? mostly the state of Kentucky. There are a lot of things. If it is not specifically stated in the Constitution, that power can go to the states. So things like the healthcare system, things like retirement. If you're a state employee of Kentucky, your retirement is done through the state of Kentucky. It's not done through any other system that's national. It's done through what the state legislature determines. And that is, those powers are reserved to the states. And it's kind of been defined differently at different points in history, but just understand that those reserved powers are the ones that are reserved specifically to the states. If I were you, I would take this. So you have national powers, those are enumerated powers. You have state powers, those are the reserved powers. And then you have concurrent powers. And what concurrent powers means is that they are both in the hands of the federal and the state government. If I were you, I would take a couple of minutes and recreate this in your notes so that you have an understanding of the differences here between the powers. But I'm not necessarily going to lecture over all of this because this is simply a recreation. If you have questions, be sure to ask. And the last thing for this is understanding the metaphors. Yes, that looks like nasty cheese, but it's actually supposed to be a cake. And it's important because these are metaphors that the AP and College Board want you to have. So understanding the difference between these is just looking at how the federal government and the state governments work together. The first type of federalism was dual federalism, and they used the layer cake model. With this one, dual federalism, it lasted from about 1789 or 1781 all the way until 1932-ish. What this meant was that there were certain powers that were to the federal government and to the state government, and there was really no changing of who was responsible for that. So up to that point, education was a state power. Health initiatives were a state power. Federal power was going to be the coining of money. Federal power was signing treaties. Federal power was working with other countries. So you're talking about an area that is very cut and dry, just like a layer cake. You can see the two layers. There's the power of the federal government on the top. There's the power of the state government on the bottom. There is no mixing together. That lasted until roughly 1932. And in 1932, because of the Great Depression, we have shifted to what looks like the really moldy piece of cheese, but that is actually a marble cake, and that is cooperative federalism. What this means is that there's much more coexistence between the federal and the state government. The state government has powers that are often seen with the federal government, and it's much more kind of combined. It's not as clear cut as who's in control. And this is why I think it's a lot harder for students to really understand federalism, because it's not a clear cut, this is what happens. An example, like I've said in the past, is education. You have the federal government that's going to provide funds to the states, but the states then have to take that determination or make that determination of how they're going to implement the federal policy. So it's much more muddled or muddied in the fact that it's not very clear as to who is in control of each individual policy, but that both are in control of the policy. So something even like Medicare or Medicaid, the federal government can give the money to the states, but the state is going to determine how that money is going to be given out. A good example would be the COVID-19 response. The White House actually put out some regulations for opening the states back up. And there were only 2 states that actually followed those regulations. The first one was like North or South Dakota. The second one was Kentucky. Everybody else kind of went on their own scale, went on their own decision. They had that power. And what you kind of saw was the peak that sort of happened, or the rise that started happening shortly after they were opening in early May or late May. Kentucky didn't necessarily see that right away because we continued to follow the national guidelines. So it's very muddied. It's very there's a lot of conflict with it, and it can be difficult for students to understand. But marble cake federalism or cooperative federalism is much more indicative of the type of government that we have now. where they're both federal and state are kind of working together to deal with problems and implement some policies. That is it for this particular lecture. Again, if you have questions, please feel free to message me or send those to me. And I'd be more than happy to answer those and help you out where I can. Thanks.